The Revelation Explained by F. G. Smith, Chapter 13, Part 3. Frederick of Saxony, surnamed the Wise, was the most powerful elector of the German Empire at the period of the Reformation. A dream he had, and relating just before the world was startled by the first great act of Reformation, is so striking that I feel justified in repeating it in this connection. It was as follows, quote, "Having gone to bed last night, tired and dispirited, I soon fell asleep after saying my prayers and slept calmly for about 2 hours and a half. I then awoke, and all kinds of thoughts occupied me until midnight. I then fell asleep again and dreamed the Almighty sent me a monk, who was a true son of Paul the Apostle. He was accompanied by all the saints, in obedience to God's command, to bear him testimony, and to assure me that he did not come with any fraudulent design, but that all he should do was conformable to the will of God. They asked my gracious permission to let him write something on the doors of the palace chapel of Wittenberg, which I conceded through my chancellor. Upon this, the monk retired thither and began to write. So large were the characters that I could read from Schweinitz what he was writing, which is about 18 miles. The pen he used was so long that its extremity reached as far as Rome, where it pierced the ears of a lion which lay there, and shook the triple crown on the Pope's head. All the cardinals and princes ran up hastily and endeavored to support it. I stretched out my arm. That moment I awoke with my arm extended, in great alarm and very angry with this monk, who could not guide his pen better. I recovered myself a little. It was only a dream. I was still half asleep, and once more closed my eyes. The dream came again. The lion, still disturbed by the pen, began to roar with all its might, until the whole city of Rome and all the states of the Holy Empire ran up to know what was the matter. The Pope called upon us to oppose this monk, and addressed himself particularly to me, because the friar was living in my dominions. I again awoke, repeated the Lord's Prayer, entreated God to preserve his holiness, and fell asleep. I then dreamt that all the princes of the empire, and we along with them, hastened to Rome and endeavored one after another to break this pen. But the greater our exertions, the stronger it became. It crackled as if it had been made of iron. We gave it up as hopeless. I then asked the monk, for I was now at Rome, now in Wittenberg, where he had got that pen, and how it came to be so strong. In those days they used goose quills for pens. "This pen," replied he, "belonged to a Bohemian goose," which would be Huss, 100 years ago. I had it from one of my old schoolmasters. It is so strong because no one can take the pith out of it, and I am myself quite astonished at it. On a sudden I heard a loud cry. From the monk's long pen had issued a host of other pens. I awoke a third time. It was daylight. End of this quote from History of the Reformation, Book 3, Chapter 4. And that was a quote by Frederick of Saxony. Frederick related the foregoing to his brother John, the Duke of York, on the morning of October 31st, 1517, stating that he had dreamed it during the previous night. The same day at noon, Martin Luther advanced boldly to the chapel at Wittenberg and posted upon the door 95 theses, or propositions, against the papal doctrine of indulgences. This was his public entrance upon the great work of Reformation. The importance of the Reformation of the 16th century is incalculable. It gave the death blow to the universal spiritual supremacy of Rome. As we have already seen, the papacy had for centuries held despotic sway over the minds and the consciences of men. One potent cause of the Reformation was the great revival of learning that marked the close of the medieval and the beginning of the modern period of history. This great mental awakening contrasted sharply with the blind ignorance and superstition of the Middle Ages, and caused many men to doubt the scriptural authority of many of the doctrines and ceremonies of the Church of Rome. Such as invocation of saints, auricular confession, use of images, worship of the Virgin Mary, etc. Scandals and abuses in the Church of Rome also hastened the Reformation. During the 15th century, the morals of that church had sunk to the greatest depths of iniquity. The popes themselves were, in some cases, monsters of impurity and iniquity, insomuch that historians are obliged to draw the veil over many of their dark deeds. But the real occasion of the revolt of the northern nations of Europe against the jurisdiction of Rome was the controversy regarding indulgences. Quote, "These in the Catholic Church are remissions to penitents of punishment due for sin, upon the performances of some work of mercy or piety, or the payment of a sum of money." End quote. When Leo X was elected to the papal dignity in 1513, he found the church in great need of money for the building of St. Peter's and other undertakings, and he had recourse to a grant of indulgences to fill the coffers of the church. The power of dispensing these indulgences in Saxony in Germany was given to a Dominican friar named Tetzel. This fanatic enthusiast entertained the most exaggerated opinion of the efficacy of indulgences. In his harangues, he uttered such expressions as the following, and I'm sorry I didn't look that word up, harangues, that's a very unusual word. He uttered such expressions as the following, quote, "Indulgences are the most precious and the most noble of God's gifts," end quote. Another quote, "There is no sin so great that an indulgence cannot remit. Only let him pay well, and all will be forgiven him," end quote. Another quote, "Come, and I will give you letters, all properly sealed, by which even the sins that you intend to commit may be pardoned," end quote. Another quote, "I would not change my privileges for those of St. Peter in heaven, for I have saved more souls by my indulgences than the apostle by his sermons," end quote. Another quote, "The Lord omnipotent hath ceased to reign. He has resigned all power to the Pope," end quote. See D. Albing's History of the Reformation, Book 3, Chapter 1. Martin Luther was an Augustine monk and a teacher of theology in the University of Wittenberg. Before Tetzel appeared in Germany, Luther possessed a wide reputation for learning and piety, and he had also entertained doubts respecting many of the doctrines of the Church. During an official visit to Rome in 1510, he was almost overwhelmed with sorrow because of the moral corruption there. But while penitentially ascending on his knees the sacred stairs of the Lateran, he seemed to hear a voice thundering in his soul, quote, "The just shall live by faith," end quote. This marked an important epoch in his career. When Tetzel appeared in Saxony with his indulgences, Luther fearlessly opposed him. He drew up 95 theses against the infamous traffic and nailed them to the door of the church at Wittenberg, and invited all scholars to criticize them and point out if they were opposed to the doctrine of the Word of God or of the early church fathers. Here, the invention of printing proved to be a powerful agency in advancing the cause of Reformation by scattering copies of these theses everywhere. And soon the continent of Europe was in a perfect turmoil of controversy. The Pope excommunicated Luther as a heretic. In reply, Luther burned the papal bull publicly at Wittenberg. Shortly afterward, Luther produced his celebrated translation of the Bible in the German language. Even a brief history of the entire Reformation would be too large for the limits of the present volume. Therefore, with a few words respecting the nature of the work of the Reformation, we will pass on to another prophetic vision. The great secret of the early success of the Reformers was their appeal from the decisions of councils and regulations of men to the Word of God. So long as the Word and Spirit of God were allowed their proper place as the governors of God's people, the work was a spiritual blessing. But this happy state of affairs did not long continue. Within a few years, the followers of the Reformers were divided into hostile sects and began to oppose and persecute each other. Luther denounced Zwingli as an heretic, and, quote, "the Calvinists would have no dealings with the Lutherans," end quote. The first Protestant creed was the Augsburg Confession in 1530. This date marks an important epoch. From this time, the people began to lose sight of the Word and Spirit of God as their governors, and to turn to the disciplines of their sects, which they upheld by every means possible. Thus, we find Calvin at Geneva, consenting to the burning of Servetus because of a difference of religious views. And in England, the Anglican Protestants waged the most bitter, cruel, and relentless war, not only against Catholics, but against all Protestants who refused to conform to the established church. The Protestants placed armies in the field and fought for their creeds, as during the 30 Years' War in Germany and the long period of the Huguenot Wars in France. The real work of the Reformation, the promulgation of so much of the truth of the Bible, was an inestimable blessing to the world. But the rise of Protestantism, organized sectism in 1530, introduced another period of apostasy, as distinct in many of its features as was that of Romanism before it. The historian D. Albing recognizes an important change at this period. He says, quote, "The first two books of this volume contain the most important epochs of the Reformation, the Protest of Spires and the Confession of Augsburg. I determined on bringing the Reformation of Germany and German Switzerland to the decisive epochs of 1530 and 1531. The history of the Reformation, properly so called, is then, in my opinion, almost complete in those countries. The work of faith has there attained its apogee, that of conferences, of interims, of diplomacy begins. The movement of the 16th century has there made its effort. I said from the very first, it is the history of the Reformation and not of Protestantism that I am relating." End quote from the preface to Volume 5. This ends Part 3 of Chapter 13.